Hope you had some fresh air and some sun. Hey, Jay, good to see you. We're going to start, so please take a seat, everyone. So we're having now a session with two business talks, business focus talks, very interesting talks. Our first speaker is Tara Raafat from Bloomberg, and she will be followed by Naso Atanas Kyriakov from GraphWise. And Tara is nowhere to be found, so I don't know what to do. Just kidding, she's getting her mic fit, and here she is.
Anyway, sorry.
All right. Tara, welcome on stage.
Thank you, thank you.
It's great to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you, Francois. I have I move my hands a lot, so how do I control this? Which one moves forward? Green moves forward. And why am I forward? Okay, great, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Raafat, for those of you who don't know me. I lead the metadata strategy and knowledge graph strategy and product at Bloomberg. And today I'm honored to be with all of you. Thank you. Got my crowd here. I'm honored to be here to actually share some of my personal experiences in the past few years, almost 15 years that I've been working in the space of knowledge graph, and the things that I've learned that it takes to really build a knowledge graph in an enterprise. So let's start with what is a knowledge graph. I'm sure all of you sitting here know very well what a knowledge graph is. So I just like this analogy that I put there. So it's really like a DNA of information, right? It encodes not just the facts, but also the relationships between them and the rules that it will allow the data to really grow, adapt, and evolve. So it's the same way that biological DNA actually works. So very quickly, we'll pass through this. And just one more thing I wanted to say is like the way I think about knowledge graph, and I think you've heard this in many different sessions that you've attended probably in the conference, is that it comprises of two different layers, right? It's the semantic layer, which really defines what things mean and how they're connected together. It's the conceptual one. And then it's the real world facts and observations that we map into that structured semantic layer. And the magic really happens when these two layers work together. That's where you can actually start doing a lot of inference and cool stuff and querying over different domains and all that. So that's just a very brief thing about the knowledge graph. So, but this is where I want to start. You know what a knowledge graph is. You've learned all the tech stack. You know everything about it. You've seen all these different tools. They're great. So now you want to go build a knowledge graph in the enterprise. So what's next? First and foremost, you need to be mentally prepared for the journey you're taking. Let's start there. You will be making a million decisions. Some of these decisions can be made upfront, but a lot of them will just dawn on you as you're building your knowledge graph in the enterprise, right? So be prepared for that. And honestly, it's more of a snake and ladder game. Trust me, you move forward, you get on a ladder, you go up, yay, we're doing awesome. And 2 minutes later, you end up on a snake head and back to maybe even before where you started, but really, you have to be prepared for that. So expect a lot of setbacks and don't get discouraged with that, but also be agile, prepare to learn, make that learning part of your progress, right? So that's the mental preparation. So we're mentally prepared, and then we're like, where do I start? As many of us these days start with ChatGPT. I'm not gonna lie, I did put that question into ChatGPT. I'm like, I'm giving a talk about this. What should I say? And this is the answer, right? Not too bad, First of all, why is it all ones? I don't know. But also, I'm sure if you put it in any other of these LLMs and generative AI stuff, you get a variation of the same thing, right? And the first thing that popped up in me was like, wait, what about the testing? What about maintenance? What about, there's a lot of steps missing, but honestly, it's still like a workflow, right? It is fine, but let's look at our first lessons learned, right? ChatGPT is awesome, but it's not that awesome, right? And it could give you instructions that are helpful, but it really requires a lot of interpretation. And the most important thing that was missing here is like, where's the strategic alignment? You know, we're just talking about just going and building something without even thinking about the strategy about it. It's just tactical thing, right? And because it's a linear workflow, it's really missing a lot of things like the enterprise constraints, the stakeholder pushbacks, legacy systems, the whole buy-in that you have to do, the knowledge barrier. So all of that was really missing. So yes, great first step, but really, let's go one step back, step 0, really. How do I get the buy-in? So the first question you have to ask is, whom do I need to get the buy-in from? Usually you start thinking about, oh, it has to be the C-suite and the business people, and that's what you aim for. Let me tell you a little story. So a few years back, I was working with this company that worked in trade-based anti-money laundering, right? And I was this like knowledge graph enthusiast, and I prepared this presentation, awesome, talking about knowledge graphs, how cool they are, what they can do, and I go and present to them. And the reaction was like, this sounds like unicorns and rainbows. How many of you have heard that, presenting knowledge graphs, honestly? And they're like, this is so cool, but this is so far away from where we are. This is really not what we can do. It's like in the future. And I was like, okay, deflated a bit, but all right, let's give it another try. So I go back, work with the team. We pick up a very specific example in trade-based anti-money laundering. It was an area that I was working on and building a tool for it. And we defined a very specific domain, and we used some clean data, and we built an end-to-end kind of example for them. And then we took it there, and we presented it second time. We did not talk about knowledge graphs. We did not bring the O word. Nothing. It's just like, hey, this is how we're going to solve your problem. This is the problem we're going to solve for you, basically. And the reaction this time was, wow, this is awesome. When can we get started, right? So very, very different. And we're like, okay, we're up the ladder. Awesome, let's go. And the next thing is that they bring in the data professionals and the engineers. And okay, we're going south again, right? And everyone's looking at us like, okay, how are you going to build this? This is not going to work. Why don't you use relational databases? They're just going to work. That's, you don't need graphs for this. How are we going to maintain this, right? So back on the snakehead. But we're like, okay, let's understand what's happening here. It's not about skepticism that this technology doesn't work. It's just about the discomfort of not knowing. Right? So these people were just uncomfortable because this is a new technology they haven't worked with. So it was like all about knowledge transfer, all about training. So at the end of the day, if you look at it, there are 3 types of people that you will deal with when you're getting the buy-in, right? One is the business people. And for them, it has to be all about the return of investment, strategic outcomes, focus on the what, not the how, right? And then you get people who are enthusiasts, but like a little bit skeptical, and they're like, okay, make sure there's knowledge transfer plan for them. There's hands-on training for them. And your designs are transparent, so they actually understand what's going on under the hood. And when you get to the skeptics, you try to use low-friction demos to show them the business-aligned use cases, but more importantly, try to bridge the knowledge gap with familiar tools. Like, okay, you work with relational databases. This is the path to, move and migrate to the graph. So they feel a little bit more comfortable in terms of what they're doing. Okay, great. So some lessons learned. Use an end-to-end demo to show value and choose a high-value problem relevant to the business, clean data. Try to learn to speak the business language if you're talking to the business people. Align your KG outcomes with like strategic drivers like faster product development, improved risk assessment, enhanced customer satisfaction and users. And these days, we all know you can position your KG actually as the foundation of the enterprise AI. So that's a good positioning, strategical positioning for what you're trying to build. Few tips, and this is a little bit about psychology more. One of the things I really learned is that when you're interacting with people, I think all of you know about this fixed mindset and growth mindset, right? And try to find some people with the growth mindset as your allies, people who know the business. Because what happens is that when you tell them about this technology, they start to think of, oh, I can actually use this thing. Use this technology doing this thing. So they can give you ideas. They can support you and like, oh, I can use your technology and solve this problem and that problem. And also make sure you create a center of knowledge graph excellence, right? So where you actually build the community, where you teach, where you do the knowledge transfer. We have a good example of that at Bloomberg, and I love it. All right, so we got the buy-in, awesome. How do you define the scope? Usually when you think about the scope, you're just thinking about the domain. I'm not talking about the domain. I'm talking about the scope of your product. What is your product, right? It's very important to define what the product actually is. Is the knowledge graph itself the product, right? If you think about DBpedia, if it was a commercial thing, it would be a product that would be sold, right? Is it actually an enabler for other products? Think about Amazon's knowledge graph, right? The product is like the e-commerce site, but there's a knowledge graph behind the scenes that helping it enables it. Is the ontology itself a product? Like if we were just selling ontology, so like something like Fibo, if it was commercial, then yeah. And then is it part of a product offering, like the awesome Samsung phones that now have their knowledge graph empowered? So it's very important to think of the role of your product, like what is that scope? Because knowing that would help you define a few things, right? The pitch you're going to make based on the scope of that product is going to be different because your funding and like strategy will be different. Your stakeholder alignment expectations, the metrics that you will set for your success, it's all going to be different. The architecture design you pick, right? The governance model, the operational planning, all will rely on what you're actually defining as the scope of your product. And also from the people and team that you're building, the required skills that need to be there. They're all commitments, and maintenance planning is all part of the scope definition. Okay. You got the buy-in, you know the scope. A lot of times people ask me like, so do I have to build from scratch? And the truth is, like a lot of the companies and enterprises we go into have legacy systems. They've built a lot there. They've invested so much money. And we cannot just go out there and tell them to like just throw it out and let's build a new knowledge graph. So another story for you. Well, first this one before I tell the story. But it's like, okay, there's an option. You can start building on the legacy system. Yes. And make iterations, or you can just say, okay, legacy systems, they're where you are. We're just going to build another system in parallel, and we're going to migrate. And each of them have their own benefits. But here's my story, specifically when you're thinking about building on top of legacy systems. So we were working with this government agency, and there was so much pressure on us to build on their legacy system. It was only a 10+ thing, so it wasn't like, I thought like, okay, it's not bad, it's just 10 years old. You will not believe it, but it literally took us 2 years just to understand what that data is in their system and figure out the identifiers. And we were like, oh my God. So lesson learned, trying to retrofit without a clear data readiness plan, it's not a good idea. Let's just don't do that. So then we go and start working with a financial institution. And I'm like, we've learned our lesson. You know, we go there and ask them to, hey, you know, give us a dedicated team for data quality. We want to make sure that you actually work on that. Or like, give us actually access to the raw data so that we can actually build the data ourselves and clean it up if needed. So we did that. We started building the ontology. We took one specific domain, and it was going well. And then it was still going so well that other teams in different parts of the organization are like, oh, we're going to start doing the same thing. So they started building. What happened? We did not have a central governance plan, right? So we ended up with inconsistent models, which were over-optimized for individual use cases because everyone went and built their own thing. We ended up with fragmented identifiers. There was so much rework to bring all of these together. And most importantly, we lost trust because we could not deliver on time. So here are the lessons learned, right? First and foremost, start with a vision, right? Because if you don't have the vision and you start even building incrementally, you might end up somewhere else and the vision might be here, right? So start with the vision and then build the path towards that vision specifically, right? Governance policy, I cannot emphasize that enough. If you want to federate building your knowledge graph, governance policies are core to it. Assess the data maturity to make sure that if you're agreeing to build something on a legacy system, it's actually doable and worth it. And make sure that you know the timeline, you know, but question it, right? Understand how, like, what's the legacy complexity, how much you can do upfront, how much, you know, like, when is it that you have to deliver? So if they tell you deliver next month and then you're dealing with really bad data, that's not possible. So that's lessons learned, all right? Okay, so now we're going to take a little sideways, like, okay, we want to build the ontology. the question is how complex, how complete, how big should this ontology be? There's a million decisions that you have to make at this phase. Like, who should be involved? Should we reuse? Should we build from scratch? Should we build or buy? What should the architecture look like? Should it be one big model? Should it be so many modules? Which standards should I stick to? There's a lot of these questions, and unfortunately, I don't have time to get into all of them, but I've picked a few of them for you that I think are pretty important. First and foremost, the strategic one, who should be involved? I think the first answer is not surprising, the ontologist. Of course you need the ontologist. They're the most skillful people in building the ontology. So and I want to clarify something here. As I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about roles. So sometimes an ontologist could play a role of a subject matter expert as well. So let's keep that in mind. So let's say we have an ontologist that's working on something, and you'll be sure that you're going to end up with a technically solid model. But if they're not the subject matter expert, they might be missing stuff from the domain, right? So the other role that we need, obviously, is a subject matter expert. And that's what we normally see in a lot of companies. They pair up with the subject matter expert and the ontologist, and they start creating a really good model, which in depth. However, there's a risk that the ontology becomes too theoretical and it really misses the business points, right? So this is when you have to think of like, I really need to bring the business in before I start building that model. So you have to make sure that your ontology is fit for purpose, and like, this is going to be great, but then the engineers are going to come in and it's like, oh yes, you built this without even talking to us, and we cannot even process this thing in our systems. It's too complex, right? So then you have to bring in the engineering as well. So make sure that they have a say, or they actually understand what's going on. And that's when, your ontology is also optimized for the downstream systems to process it, okay? The only risk here is that it contains, it could get a little bit complicated. There are way too many roles, way too many people to handle. And that's why you need a dedicated KG product owner, right? Someone who's going to do the whole orchestration of these people. And which means that you're going to get input from all areas to ensure a smooth integration and use. But your KG might be too good, right? That's the only risk. That is the only risk. All right, so we know who got involved. We build our star team. Make sure you find the right balance between theory and practice. Make sure you form the star team. Make sure you connect the dots. Do not isolate your ontologists from the business and the engineers. Make sure they are all involved. Make sure there's knowledge transfer and good understanding. And of course, expect iterations. Okay, the next question is, do I reuse or not reuse? I think the reuse thing is obviously very, very obvious. Like, you don't want to recreate the wheel. You want to go out there and see what's out there. So let's see how should you reuse, right? So obviously start with the existing ontologies. Go out there, see who's built what, right? But the most important thing in this part of your journey is to make sure that if you're reusing stuff, you adapt it to your needs. Do not try to force fit your data into an existing model just because it's an existing model or it has been adapted by a lot of people, right? The other thing that usually people don't think about when it comes to reuse, they always think about the external ontologies. They never start thinking about, hey, maybe there's a lot of stuff within the company. Maybe there's metadata models, maybe there are other data models or schemas even that I can reuse in order to make my journey a little bit smoother and faster, right? So make sure you do that as well. And expect uniqueness. Your ontology is for your business, right? So it's going to be unique, and that's great. However, what I also want to say is that there's some pitfalls with the reuse, right? So you have to be careful with that. And I already mentioned the first one, which is the force-fitting nightmare, right? As you try to fit all your data into an external model, it might become too complex, unnecessary, like you just have data about like 1/4 of that model, and then for whatever reason, you just import everything and import a lot of unnecessary complexity. But I also want to be very careful when you do reuse from inside, right? You might end up with a good enough fallacy. And the example for this is a lot of times you're like, okay, I start my ontology with a schema, right? And I just do the first version, translating the schema into an ontology. And then people were like, oh, awesome, this is good enough. You don't need to extend it anymore. But like, no, this was just a translation. So it's going to be a lot of back and forth between like, this is really not the good ontology. It's just a translation of the schema. So it becomes a little bit hard to fight that fight. The other thing is a table trap. And it'd be like, oh, so then your ontology is just another representation of the table, and you do not want to fall into that trap. You know, just, okay, if you're starting with the schema, it's okay, but be very clear from the very beginning. And the legacy lock-in, right? You do not want to be carrying forward limitations from the legacy system. So if you're reusing things from them, be very careful with that. So reuse as long as they don't create too much complexity, adapt to your domain. Internal reuse could be practical, and find the right balance. Oh, I missed the tip. I don't know how to go back. Yeah. This is actually a good tip that one of my friends was, as we were talking about it, mentioned, is like, if you are using open source ontologies, try to actually get involved in the community so that you can influence, right? So that's actually a really, really good thing. The other thing is like, do I build upfront or start small and iterate? Probably everyone would be like, duh, you're going to iterate, Tara. Come on, there's no way that you're just going to build everything upfront. And yes, that is true. However, we have to think about a few key things. What is the domain size in terms of variety? And I'm not talking volume, right? And the complexity. The domain might be so small that I can just build the ontology upfront. What's the time to market pressure that I have? So I may have a year to build the ontology. I'm going to spend time building a really good ontology. Most important, what are the impact of the changes in my model on the downstream applications? Am I going to break applications if I keep changing? In that sense, the less changes, the less iterations, the better I am, you know, with my system and not breaking it. And also the product scope and use cases. Remember, we just talked about the product scope. That also determines if you want to build the ontology upfront or just keep iterating. Again, even building it upfront doesn't mean you're not going to add anything and not change it. It will happen. It's just that it's in much less frequency and cadence. So if you look at a simple search example, right, that basically the users are interacting with just an interface to get results, you don't care about the ontology as the user. You just want to make sure that the tool you're using is giving you good results. So as the ontology evolves in the backend, the product person can actually keep versioning it and give you better results. And you're like, yay, awesome, I'm getting better results now. So you're happy. However, if you're actually coding to those results, or if the product is the ontology itself which you're using, every change to that ontology will affect your product, right? So if you're coding to the results of like, oh, this is a certain classification I'm getting, or this is the results that I get that I want to send to my, I don't know, training sessions, or the training models, and or if it's just the ontology itself that I'm reusing, and suddenly it changes, it might break your code. So in that case, usually, you know, building upfront is, at least to some good extent, is a good practice, right? But the most important thing is that in that case, you know, versioning and change management is critical, regardless of whether you're iterating or building more in upfront and then iterating. So define product, anticipate updates, governance, change management, essential. So essential that we actually have a panel about it tomorrow that my colleague Mike Poole is running, so make sure to be there as well. All right. This is a little bit of a continuation of that, which is breadth first or depth first. And I think it's kind of simple. It would really, it's about the use case, right? If you want to connect across multiple silos, go breadth first, right? And then start going down. But if you're dealing with a very specific, complex or sensitive domain, then start to spend more time going deep, right? And make sure, and if you want to use inference, if you want to use validations and reasoning also, I think that's a good choice. These are some examples, you know, regulatory compliance, financial product modeling, clinical trials. These are very sensitive domains, right? So going depth first, it's a good idea. However, something like a data catalog, you want to go broad. I'm also mindful of time. So automate or curate. Yes, we're going to use LLMs. Yes, they're not going to give us a good ontology. The ontology is here. I'm sorry, but we're not going to ignore the fact that we're going to use them, right? And they're a good start, right? You know, they can give you some entities, some relationships, some hierarchies, but do not replace the ontologies. There's human refinement needed there, right? They can't think strategically. They can't think long-term. They cannot do strategic alignment for you. So they can help you maybe start faster, but And I have to say, for now, I don't know what the future brings, but it's the human experts who actually need to ensure that you're building something that's sustainable and meaningful. One model or many models, right? Let's be realistic. In a very large enterprise, it's almost impossible to enforce one single model. So what you have to do is to think a little bit more strategically of what are the different strategies I can adapt in order to have people be more aligned, right, and flexible. So you can, if you have one ontology, you can create multiple views of it. Pretty simple solution. Alternative labels. A lot of times people are really meaning the same thing. They're just using a different terminology for it. Use your alternative labels. Find the right balance between taxonomies and ontologies, right? Where do you stop with the ontology, upper level ontology, and then start creating taxonomies, which are way more flexible and they could be adaptive to the domains. Also, mappings, right? If people are building different ontologies, make your focus on how do I map that into something common or map them with each other, or map them with an upper level common ontology. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this because I'm mindful of the time. And so make sure you have a stable upper ontology, because that's what kind of like, at the end of the day, will help you with extension of domains and mapping, the taxonomies that could map up to your upper level ontology. So that is the core thing that you have to focus on for unification and flexibility. And last but not least is some misconception that a knowledge graph, you must centralize everything, and that is not true, right? There are variables you have to consider prior to deciding on your architecture. What is the security of the data? Sometimes you cannot move the data in a central knowledge graph place, right? What is the volume you're dealing with? So what's the query speed, the scale, the access control mechanisms? What's the performance you're expecting? What's the governance? Do you have a central authority, or do you want to actually make a distributed governance model? And the level of interoperability and alignment that you're expecting. So all of this will give you, again, 3 different models, each of which have their own benefits and their own challenges. And there are certain areas which you can use each one for, but I'm not sure if I can actually, do I have time to go through this?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes.
Don't stop.
So yeah, the centralized one, obviously, let's look at it this way, so it's easier. It's a simplified architecture. It's much easier to query because you're bringing everything in one place. It's uniform. But the challenges is like it has a high integration cost because you have to bring all the data you have from different silos and put them in one place, right? The governance, scaling, and governance becomes sometimes a little bit of bottleneck because you usually have a central governance. And also, it's going to be a slower onboarding because every single data set, you have to bring it into one central place. But if you have teams that share the similar semantics, or you're dealing with smaller organizations and there's a high need for consistency, then this is a good thing for you. Federated, I'm talking about fully federated here, right? Which means that, you become scalable and modular, faster domain stuff, and teams retain autonomy. It's like similar example that I gave you about like the experience that we had. But what you have to focus on is like, you have to make sure you have the governance policy because it becomes much harder to govern. And the querying across different domains become a little bit complex. You might see still semantic inconsistencies. However, if you're working in large organizations that have very diverse domains that don't necessarily need to connect everything, but they're building knowledge graphs in their own space is good enough, then go with that, right? Or if data cannot be physically centralized due to what we were talking about in terms of security. Hybrid, mostly the best approach in many organizations, as from my personal experience, is that it balances the control and autonomy, it encourages reuse alignment, and it enables you to grow over time. Obviously, still governance is needed. It's a little bit complex because you kind of have one central governance and then some distributed governance. And it goes back again to that one upper level ontology that you want to have there to be able to map things to. But it really works for growing or global enterprises and with multiple domains that you really want to connect. So they're now siloed, but you really want to query across them. And in systems where legacy and modern systems coexist. So this is a really helpful solution in that area. Final takeaways, just a few of them here. The journey, it's not linear. The snake and ladder, be prepared for that. Governance is essential. Treat your knowledge graph as a living thing. It's going to be evolving. And avoid enforcing one size fits all. That's not possible. Ontology design requires collaboration. Build that star team of yours and begin with strategic alignment prior to getting into implementation and secure engagement at all levels. That is very important. And steer clear of making a very rigid system. And select your architecture based on a thoughtful analysis of the key variables that I just showed. And with that, thank you so much. Do you have time for questions or?
Thank you very much,
No
Tara.
time for questions. I'm sorry,
Tara,
but
you will
I'm
be
here.
around. Yes.
Yes, I'm here. So any questions would be happy to answer.
And then
Thank you.
there's a